Did Caesar Rodney really ride 80 miles from Dover, Delaware to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania on horseback in a thunderstorm to sign the Declaration of Independence? Nope.
All right, how's it going, everybody? Today we're going to talk about Caesar Rodney, the man, myth, and legend. Now, when it comes to Delaware, Caesar Rodney is pretty much everywhere. Here you can see him that's on the back of the Delaware driver's license. He's on the back of the state quarter from 1999. You also have here a Caesar Rodney doll, and of course, there's a Rodney Road. I think there's actually a couple Rodney Roads in Delaware. And so there's a Caesar Rodney High School. There is or was a statue of Caesar Rodney in Wilmington Square of him up on his horse. You can see it here. He's also on banners, and actually he is on all the street signs. A lot of people don't realize that. They put him on all the street signs. So Caesar Rodney really is Delaware's hero of the 18th century. However, very little is actually known about Caesar Rodney, and there is a reason for that. So when scholars generally begin to research historic figures, one of the first things they draw on are their papers. Usually they leave behind a ton of papers, and Caesar Rodney was no exception to that. He left behind tons of papers. In fact, there's a book that you can see right here, which is 482 pages of letters that Caesar Rodney wrote and had written to him. The problem is that of these 482 pages, about 470 pages of it consist of very benign business matters that don't really shed any light on him personally. So perhaps one thing we can learn from these papers, or absence of personal papers, is that Caesar Rodney was actually a very private man. Perhaps as a result of this, a few myths have been started about Caesar Rodney. Here you can see him on top of his horse in the statue in Wilmington. And what this is meant to represent is, of course, Caesar Rodney galloping to Philadelphia at a moment's notice to vote in favor of independence. Also like Delaware's version of Paul Revere, essentially. However, in all likelihood, this did not happen. Here we have a portrait that everyone generally recognizes as Caesar Rodney, but the problem with this is that it's not actually Caesar Rodney. This is a 20th century drawing that somebody made up of him, and it appeared in Thomas J. Scharf's book, The History of Delaware. So there are no existing portraits of Rodney, and there might also be a reason for that. However, all that aside, piecing together other first-hand accounts of Rodney from people like his brother and various others, we can start to get a clearer picture of what Rodney was really like. So Caesar Rodney was born on October 7th, 1728, to C.A. Rodney and Elizabeth Crawford. His dad was also actually named Caesar Rodney, not to be too confusing, but his father is actually Caesar Rodney Sr. He would be the first of 8 children that the couple would have. One of his brothers, Tommy, would play a large role in his life. His name was Thomas Rodney, but he affectionately referred to him as Tommy. The family settled on a farm called Poplar Grove, which was located just south of Dover, Delaware. When Caesar Rodney was 11 years old, he was sent to the Latin School in Philadelphia to receive a formal education. Caesar Rodney's father passed away when he was only 17 years old, and being that he was the oldest adult male in the family, it is likely that the obligations of raising his 8 brothers and sisters fell on him. Okay, so the next slide here, you can see this is a depiction of where Caesar Rodney lived. He had his house on the original Byfield patent, and the cemetery where the Rodneys are buried was right next to it. This is actually very close to the Dickinson Mansion, if you know where that is, just south of Dover, and Dover Air Force Base is actually very close by as well. So Caesar Rodney never married and never had any children. However, we do know that he was interested in women from different love letters that he had sent. And in fact, there was a woman who he was dating called Mary Vinning when he was in his 30s. And he had actually planned to probably marry her. But unfortunately, there is a letter that exists where she's rejected him and chosen another person to marry. And he writes that he's very basically heartbroken about this. Now, we can't say for sure why he was rejected or why he was never married and had kids, but as you'll see a little bit later, there might actually be some reasons for that. So there are a few quotes about what Caesar Rodney looked like. And the first one we have here is from John Adams, which says, "He is the oddest looking man in the world. He is tall, thin, and slender. As a reed, pale, his face is not bigger than a large apple, yet there is a sense and fire, spirit, wit, and humor in his countenance." Now, I don't know if John Adams was exaggerating with the large apple, but from what we get from that is that Caesar Rodney was very odd looking, which may in fact be partially why he never had success in the romantic department. We can't say that for sure, but the second quote is from Thomas Rodney, which said he had great fund of wit and humor of the pleasant kind, so that his conversation was always bright and strong and conducted by wisdom. All right, so Caesar Rodney entered into public life in about 1755. At this time, we were still a British colony, and we were at war with France over land in the western part of the country. Caesar was commissioned as captain in a Dover militia unit, which was in response to this war. It is likely that they trained and drilled in Dover. However, there is no proof that they ever saw any kind of action, and it's very unlikely that they did. It was simply a militia unit that was called out in case they were needed. It was also around this time, in 1755, that he was elected as the High Sheriff of Kent County, which was a position that he would hold for 3 years. And essentially, as High Sheriff, he would be determining law enforcement and seeing different cases. During his life, Caesar held many different positions, and it's difficult to keep them all straight. It's amazing that he managed to hold all these positions. So rather than confuse you with tons of dates and the different positions he held, I figured I would just provide you with a list here. So it's quite extensive. Obviously, there are some standout ones. He was the governor of Delaware for a while. He was obviously in the Continental Congress, and so we will talk a little bit about a couple of these positions later. In 1766, the English Crown passed the Stamp Act on the colonies. Now, this act put a tax on all printed paper that would bear a British stamp. As a result of this act, there were riots and protests in the colonies. The colonies formed the Stamp Act Congress in New York City to deal with this situation. Now, Caesar Rodney, along with Thomas McKean, were selected to represent Delaware at the Stamp Act Congress. At this point, Caesar was still on the fence about his break from Britain, and in some of his letters, there was some conflict going back and forth internally on how he felt about that. The Stamp Act would be repealed, however, and then the Crown would pass the Townshend Act on the colonies, which put taxes on goods. This led to more protests, and the Townshend Act really hurt Caesar Rodney financially because they farmed and sold goods. Now that those goods were being taxed, this was likely the tipping point of when Caesar Rodney began to believe that independence was necessary.